7 other gods appear by name in the Hebrew Bible, with temples, priesthoods, festivals, followers, and in at least 3 cases construction funded straight out of the royal treasury in Jerusalem. Not vague references to idolatry. Names: Ashtoreth, Chemosh, Dagon, Milcom, Asherah, the Queen of Heaven, and Elyon, the Most High, who in one ancient reading of one famous poem is not the same figure as Yahweh at all. And here's the number that reorganizes the whole picture. The sentence most Americans think summarizes the entire Bible. In the King James, "I am the Lord, and there is none else. There is no God beside me." That flat, absolute, no other gods exist claim shows up in the book of Isaiah, around chapter 45. And almost every historian who works on this material, across Jewish, Christian, and secular institutions, dates that section of Isaiah to the 6th century BCE during or just after the Babylonian exile. Which means that sentence lands late, centuries after Solomon, centuries after the Judges. Late. So what's in the rest of the library, in the older material, is something different, and much more interesting than a list of embarrassments. What we're going to walk through today is not a case of hidden verses. It's the record of an argument. A community working out, over roughly 1,000 years, what the word God even meant, and keeping the earlier stages of that argument in the same book as the conclusion. Along the way, a Moabite victory monument sitting in the Louvre right now that talks about Israel exactly the way Israel's texts talk about Moab. 2 storage jars from a desert way station with a blessing written on the side in old Hebrew script that a lot of scholars think names Yahweh's consort, and a real grammatical objection to that reading which you deserve to hear. A statue with its head on a threshold. A group of refugee women in Egypt arguing with a prophet out loud in the text and not losing. And a scrap of leather from a cave near the Dead Sea that changes one word in one verse and shifts the sky above the whole thing. If that's your kind of investigation, subscribing and hitting like is genuinely what decides whether this reaches anybody. That's the whole ask. Now, start where most Americans start with this subject, which is a memory. Vacation Bible School, one of those laminated charts on the wall with everybody's name down the side and gold star stickers for memory verses. First commandment, King James, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me." That's the verse. And the Hebrew behind "before me" is a phrase that literally means something like "in my presence," "to my face," "alongside me." Translators have wrestled with it forever, and you'll see it rendered as "before me," "besides me," or "in my presence," depending on which English Bible you pick up. Read it in any of those forms and notice what it's actually doing. It isn't a statement about how many gods exist. It's a demand for exclusive loyalty in a world where everybody assumed the sky was crowded. We still write commitments that way. A wedding vow doesn't claim that no other people exist on earth. It says, "You and no one else in my house." That's a loyalty structure, and it only makes sense if the alternatives are real options. Scholars have a word for that kind of religion: monolatry, worshipping one god exclusively while assuming other gods are out there. Different from monotheism, which is the claim that only one god exists at all. And the historical question that a lot of very careful people have spent their careers on is when Israelite religion moved from the first thing to the second. The names are how you trace it. Before any of the 7, look at the vocabulary. Because the crowd in the sky isn't smuggled into odd corners of the text. It's in the grammar of the first sentence. The word for God in the opening of Genesis is Elohim, and that word is, in its form, a plural. Hebrew builds plurals with that, ending the way English adds an S. Where it gets strange is that when Elohim means the God of Israel, the verbs attached to it are almost always singular. God creates, singular. God says, singular. A plural noun taking singular verbs hundreds of times. Then, in the first chapter, verse 26, the King James, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." Us. Our. Now, how to read that is a live argument, and anyone who tells you it's settled is selling you something. Some scholars and traditional commentators read it as a plural of majesty, the way an institution might say, "we" in a formal document. Others point out that the royal "we" isn't well attested in ancient Hebrew and read it instead as God addressing a heavenly court. Christian tradition has read it as an early hint of the Trinity, the teaching that God is 3 persons in one being, though most historians would say that reading comes from later theology brought back to the verse rather than from the verse itself. Jewish tradition has read it as God speaking to the angels. I'm not going to pick your answer. What I want you to see is the neighborhood of language it sits in, because that's where the plain reading gets its weight. Take the Song of the Sea in Exodus, chapter 15. A poem whose Hebrew is so archaic that many linguists consider it among the oldest material in the Bible. In the King James, "Who is like unto thee, O Lord, among the gods?" Among the gods. That's not a taunt at empty statues. It's a comparison, and a comparison requires something on the other side of it. Then the Psalms. 95, verse 3. For the Lord is a great God, and a great King above all gods. Above. There's a stack, and Yahweh is on top of it. And then Psalm 82, which is the strangest one and worth reading slowly. It opens with God standing up in an assembly. The King James says, "In the congregation of the mighty, he judgeth among the gods." What follows is a scene where these other divine beings get charged with failing at their jobs. They haven't defended the poor. They've let the wicked win. And the sentence handed down is that they will die like men. That's a courtroom in the sky, and the defendants are gods. Mark Smith, who taught at New York University and later at Princeton, and wrote 2 of the standard books on this, The Early History of God and the Origins of Biblical Monotheism, argues that texts like these preserve an older stage of Israelite thinking in which Yahweh operates inside a divine world populated by other powers, and that the absolute claim of one and only comes later, under specific, historical pressure. And there's a real counterposition worth naming. Yeheskel Kaufman, who taught at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, argued across a massive multi-volume study that Israelite monotheism was early and radical, and that the Bible's own writers show no real understanding of pagan mythology from the inside, which, in his reading, means they were already outside it. Some scholars today still argue for a much earlier monotheism and read the plural language as poetic inheritance rather than lived belief. So this is contested. Hold both. What isn't contested is the vocabulary itself. The words are on the page, in every English Bible, in the same chapters people read out loud on Sunday. And you're noticing them is not a crack in anything. It's reading. First name. And she comes with a date range that I had to check twice. 1 Kings, chapter 11, the account of Solomon's later years. The King James. For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Zidonians. Goddess. That's the word the narrator uses. Not idol, not nothing, not a block of wood. The Hebrew is the feminine form of the same word used for the God of Israel. She's Astarte, the great goddess of the Phoenician world, with temples from the Egyptian delta up through the Levantine coast, related to Ishtar in Mesopotamia, and later folded into how the Greeks talked about Aphrodite. Sidon, the city named in that verse, is on the coast of what's now Lebanon. Solomon's alliance with that region is all over the account of his reign. The timber for the temple came from there. Now here's the piece that teaches you something about how the text was transmitted, and it's a genuinely elegant bit of detective work. Her name in Hebrew, everywhere in the Bible, is vocalized in a way that doesn't match what we'd expect for Astarte. The consonants are right. The vowels aren't. And a lot of scholars have proposed that the vowels come from the Hebrew word bashet, meaning shame, that the name was pronounced with a built-in editorial comment. If that's right, and it's a widely held reading, though not a certainty, then somebody in the chain of transmission handled a name they found offensive by changing how it sounded rather than by deleting it. They kept the god and pronounced her shame. That's not a cover-up. That's an editorial fingerprint left in plain view, which is exactly the kind of thing textual scholars live for. The wider story of how the Hebrew Bible got copied, corrected, standardized, and handed down over the centuries is a whole investigation of its own. If you haven't sat with it yet, there's a video here on the channel called "The Bible Wasn't Written the Way You Were Taught," and it walks that same trail in detail. Worth going through after this one. Back to Solomon's Hill, because the timeline is the real story. 1 Kings tells you he built high places for foreign gods on the mountain east of Jerusalem, the ridge we call the Mount of Olives, and then the text goes quiet on that hill for a very long time. It comes back in 2 Kings, chapter 23. King Josiah, in a sweeping reform, is clearing out cult sites across Jerusalem and Judah. The narrator lists what he defiles, and it includes, in the King James, the high places that were before Jerusalem, which were on the right hand of the Mount of Corruption, which Solomon the king of Israel had builded for Ashtoreth, the abomination of the Zidonians. Mount of Corruption. In Hebrew, that's a wordplay on the Mount of Anointing. The writer is punning on the Mount of Olives. Do the arithmetic. Solomon's reign ends somewhere around 930 BCE on the standard chronology. Josiah's reform is dated to around 622 BCE. That's roughly 3 centuries in between, with those installations standing on the ridge across the valley from the temple. And the kings in that stretch include the ones the biblical writers praise: Asa, Jehoshaphat, Hezekiah, who the text says removed high places and cut down cult objects and even destroyed the bronze serpent from the wilderness story. The account of Hezekiah's reform is detailed. It doesn't mention that hill. Now, careful here, because this is where popular versions overreach in both directions. Historians disagree about how much of the reform material is a later composition, written to make a theological point, and about how literally to read the 3-century span. Some read it as archival memory. Others read it as the Josiah-era writers dramatizing how deep the problem ran. But either way, notice what the biblical writers chose to say. They could have told you the shrine went up and came down in one reign. Instead, they anchored it to Solomon by name and left it standing across the whole line of kings. That's an editorial decision, and it's a strange one for propaganda. Second name, and this one has something the others mostly don't: a monument from the other side. Judges, chapter 11. Jephthah, a warlord the book presents as a deliverer of Israel, is in a border dispute with the king of Ammon. He sends a diplomatic message, and in the King James it reads, "Wilt not thou possess that which Chemosh thy God giveth thee to possess? So whomsoever the Lord our God shall drive out from before us, them will we possess, Chemosh thy God." Then, in the same breath, the Lord our God. Identical structure, 2 names, 2 nations, 2 land grants. Chemosh was the national god of Moab, the kingdom east of the Dead Sea. And what Jephthah is doing is not conceding anything about worship. He's making a legal argument in the shared diplomatic language of his world. Your God handed you your territory, ours handed us ours, so stay on your side of the line. If that premise weren't common ground, the letter wouldn't work as a letter. And we know it was common ground, because in 1868, a German missionary named Frederick Augustus Klein was traveling in what's now Jordan at a village called Dagon and was shown a black basalt stone about 3 feet tall covered in writing. It ended up, after a genuinely chaotic few years involving competing European agents and the stone being broken apart and reassembled, in the Louvre in Paris, where it sits today. It's called the Mesha Stele, and it's the longest inscription we have in Moabite, a language so close to Hebrew that if you can read one, you can largely read the other. It dates to the 9th century BCE, and it's a royal victory monument by Mesha, king of Moab. Read what he says. He credits Chemosh with everything. Chemosh was angry with Moab and let Israel oppress it. Then Chemosh saved him. Chemosh told him to go up and take a town. He took it, and he describes devoting its inhabitants to the god. He names Omri, king of Israel, by name. And he writes a line that stopped me the first time I read it in translation, that Israel has perished forever. Sit with that for a second. A Moabite king, writing in the same century as some of the material in Kings, using the exact theological framework the biblical writers use. Our God was angry, so we lost. Our God turned, so we won. With the names swapped. That's not a mirror the Bible is hiding from you. It's a mirror that makes the Bible legible. This was the shared language of the ancient Levant, and Israel spoke it fluently before it started saying something else. Which brings us to the passage that even careful commentators handle with tongs. 2 Kings, chapter 3. Israel, Judah, and Edom invade Moab and are winning. Mesha, the same king, most historians think, gets cornered in his own city. And he takes his oldest son, the heir, and offers him as a burnt offering on the city wall, in view of both armies. Then, in the King James, "And there was great indignation against Israel, and they departed from him, and returned to their own land." Great indignation. The Hebrew word there is the standard word for wrath or fury, and the text does not say whose. It just reports the sequence: the offering, then wrath, then Israel withdrawing. Interpretations run in every direction. Some scholars read it as the narrator preserving an old account in which Chemosh responded, a startling admission left in place. Others read the wrath as Yahweh's, provoked by something in the campaign. Others read it as human revulsion in the ranks, an army that saw a child burned on a wall and lost its stomach for the siege. Honestly, the ambiguity may be the most interesting fact about the verse. The writer had a chance to explain and didn't take it, and that restraint tells you that whoever preserved this had a different relationship to the material than a later system would have preferred. If this is the kind of detail you want more of, hitting like is what pushes it toward the next person. And if you've got somebody in your life who reads these books carefully and would want the Mesha Stele in their hands, pass it along. Third name, and this one is a story, not a policy. The Philistines capture the ark, the gold-covered chest that the texts treat as the seat of Yahweh's presence. And they take it home to Ashdod, one of their 5 main cities on the southern coast. And they do what made sense in their world. They set it in the temple of their god, beside the statue. Captured God goes in the victor's house. 1 Samuel, chapter 5. Next morning, the statue of Dagon is face down on the ground in front of the ark. They set it back up. Next morning, it's down again, and this time, in the King James, the head of Dagon and both the palms of his hands were cut off upon the threshold. Only the stump of Dagon was left to him. The head on the doorstep, the hands on the doorstep, the rest of it on the floor. Now, you may have heard that Dagon was a fish god and that the surviving part was the fish half. That reading has been repeated for centuries. It goes back to medieval Jewish commentators connecting the name to the Hebrew word for fish, dag, and current scholarship has largely moved off it. The reason is Ugarit, a city on the Syrian coast whose archives were dug up starting in 1929 and gave us a library of texts in a language closely related to Hebrew. Dagon shows up there as a major, senior deity, associated with grain, which is what the word Dagon means in Hebrew too. Not fish, grain. He appears as the father of Baal in that material. So the popular fish version is an etymology that didn't survive contact with the evidence, which is itself worth knowing because it cuts against the assumption that the older reading is always the suppressed truth. Sometimes the older reading is just wrong, and better evidence corrects it. That's how this field actually works. What the story is doing, though, is unmistakable. 2 divine houses, 1 contest, 1 loser. And the Philistines in the text say it themselves. The King James has them complaining that Yahweh's hand is sore upon us and upon Dagon, our God. Our God. In their mouths. The narrator lets them say it. And then comes the detail that tells you what kind of writing this is. The next verse explains that this is why, to this day, the priests of Dagon and anyone entering that temple don't step on the threshold in Ashdod. That's an origin story for a ritual custom. The scene exists, at least in part, to explain a practice a first audience would have recognized. Here's where a particular way of reading earns its keep. Baruch Spinoza. And most people know him, if they know him at all, as the philosopher who got in enormous trouble for how he read the Bible. Actually spent real time on Hebrew itself. He left behind an unfinished Hebrew grammar, published after his death in 1677 along with the rest of his papers. That's an odd hobby for a man supposedly out to demolish the text. It's the hobby of somebody who wanted to know what the words were doing. And one of his central claims in the Theological Political Treatise, a treatise being just a long, sustained argument on one subject, published in 1670, was that Scripture speaks in the concepts and images available to the people it was first addressed to, not in the concepts of a later century, not in the categories of a system that hadn't been built yet. Which means when the text hands you 2 divine houses and a statue on a threshold, the first job isn't to translate it into a doctrine you already hold. The first job is to ask what a listener in Ashdod, or in Shiloh, or in a village in the Judean hills would have pictured. That's a discipline, not a demolition. And it's available to anybody with a decent English Bible and some patience. 4th name. And with this one, we move from stories into the machinery of statecraft, which is where a lot of the confusion about ancient religion clears up fast. Milcom, the national god of Ammon, the kingdom whose capital sits under the modern city of Amman in Jordan. 1 Kings, chapter 11, lists him alongside Ashtoreth, in the King James, Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. 2 Kings 23 names him again in Josiah's cleanup. And there's a small textual wrinkle in between that shows you how manuscripts behave. A couple of verses later, that same chapter of 1 Kings names the Ammonite god as Molech instead of Milcom. The Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, the Septuagint, made by Jewish scholars in Egypt starting in the 3rd century BCE, reads Milcom there. Most scholars treat the difference as a variation in one name, and some connect it to the same underlying word for king, small thing. But it's the kind of small thing that reminds you these are copied documents with histories. Milcom isn't only in the Bible, either. A stone inscription recovered from the citadel of Amman, generally dated to around the 9th century BCE, opens with a divine command attributed to Milcom, and Ammonite personal names built on his name turn up on seals. He was a real god with a real establishment, exactly as advertised. Now, why would Solomon's administration build him a shrine outside Jerusalem? Because in that world, a royal marriage was a treaty, and a treaty had liturgy. When a king took a wife from another kingdom, she didn't arrive alone. She came with a household, an entourage, and the expectation that her family's God could be honored in her new home. That arrangement wasn't sentimental. It was the diplomatic instrument itself, the equivalent of a signed and sealed alliance, with a building as the paperwork. Historians of the ancient Near East see this pattern across the region, so the shrine on the ridge isn't best understood as one man's spiritual failure, though that's exactly how the biblical writers frame it, and their framing is part of the historical record too. Structurally, it's an embassy. And once you see it that way, the 3 centuries stop being mysterious. Embassies are expensive to close. Every king who left that hill alone had reasons that had nothing to do with private conviction. Trade routes, treaty obligations, the families of foreign-born queens still living in the palace, the plain political cost of insulting a neighbor. Here's the modern echo, and it's gentler than you might expect. Anyone in an American family where 2 traditions married knows this negotiation from the inside. The Catholic side and the Baptist side working out the wedding. Who's priest? Who's pastor? Whose music, whose grandmother gets to say the blessing at the reception. The Hindu family in a New Jersey suburb whose daughter marries into a Presbyterian family, and now there are 2 ceremonies and a whole lot of careful phone calls. Nobody in that situation is abandoning anything. They're building an arrangement that lets 2 households stay in relationship. Multiply that by a national treasury and an army, and you've got the Mount of Olives. That's not idolatry as a character flaw. That's foreign policy with an altar attached. And understanding the difference is a genuine gain in historical literacy, because it explains the persistence that moralizing can't. 5th name, and this is the one that gets written about the most, argued about the hardest, and reported the most sloppily. 2 Kings, chapter 23, Josiah's reform. The King James says he brought out the grove from the house of the Lord and burned it in the Kidron Valley, the ravine just outside the eastern wall of Jerusalem. Grove. That's the King James rendering. What's actually in the Hebrew is the word Asherah. Modern translations handle it differently. The New International and the English Standard both say Asherah pole. That translation history matters, because if the only Bible in your house was a King James, you read that verse and pictured landscaping. Nobody engineered that. 17th century English translators used the Latin and Greek traditions available to them, and grove was the inherited guess. But it's a clean example of how a word can go quiet across 400 years of a language. Keep reading that chapter. The next verse describes Josiah breaking down quarters that stood inside the temple complex. The King James wording is rough and older translations handled it awkwardly. Modern versions render it as the rooms of the shrine attendants. And it specifies that in those rooms, the women wove hangings for the grove, for the Asherah, rooms, staff, ongoing textile production. Inside the temple precinct. Go back a couple of centuries in the same books and you find King Asa removing his own grandmother Maacah from her position as queen mother because she had made an image for Asherah. A member of the royal family, holding an office, removed over this. And in the Elijah material, 1 Kings chapter 18, when the confrontation on Mount Carmel is called, the summons includes 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah, all eating at the queen's table, meaning on royal support. Worth flagging, honestly. Some scholars think that mention of Asherah's prophets is a later addition to the verse, partly because they never appear again in the story. It's disputed. But the fact that a later editor could add it tells you the concept was familiar. Now the archaeology, and I want to give you both the finding and the fight. In 1975 and 1976, Zeev Meshel of Tel Aviv University excavated a small remote site in the northeastern Sinai called Kuntillet Ajrud. Most likely a way station on a desert route, occupied briefly around 800 BCE. Inside, among plaster inscriptions and drawings, were 2 large storage jars with writing on them in Old Hebrew script. The inscriptions are blessings. One reads, in the standard translation, "Blessed be Yahweh of Samaria and his Asherah." Another, "Blessed be Yahweh of Teman and his Asherah." And about 40 miles away, at a tomb site called Khirbet el-Qom near Hebron, an inscription dated to roughly the late 8th century BCE carries a similar formula. A man blessed by Yahweh and by his Asherah. What stays with me about the jars, honestly, is how ordinary they are. This isn't a royal monument or a temple dedication. It's storage pottery at a truck stop in the desert. Somebody wrote a blessing on the side of a jar the way you'd scratch initials into wet concrete. So, does his Asherah mean the goddess? William Dever, the American archaeologist who spent decades in the field in Israel, argued yes in a book he titled "Did God Have a Wife?" in 2005, and he's not alone. The main objection is grammatical, and it's serious. In Hebrew, you generally don't attach a possessive ending to a personal name. You wouldn't say his David. So a number of scholars argue the phrase must refer to a cult object or a wooden symbol associated with the goddess, his Asherah pole, his shrine, rather than to the goddess herself. Judith Hadley, among others, has laid out the cautious case in detail. And there's a middle position, that the object stood for her closely enough that the distinction didn't matter much to the person writing on the jar. Where does that leave you? With a real finding and an unresolved reading, which is the normal condition of ancient history, and being comfortable there is a skill. What's not in dispute? The word Asherah appears about 40 times in the Hebrew Bible. The biblical writers treat it as a live problem for centuries, and a goddess named Asherah is well documented in the Ugarit texts as the consort of the high god El. The pieces are all real. The assembly is argued. Sixth name, and this is where the whole subject stops being about kings and becomes about kitchens. Jeremiah, chapter 7. The prophet is describing what people in Judah are doing, and the King James renders it. The children gather wood, and the fathers kindle the fire, and the women knead their dough to make cakes to the Queen of Heaven. Read the division of labor. Kids on firewood, dads on the fire, mothers on the dough. A recipe, a specific offering, a specific recipient. The Queen of Heaven is a title, not a personal name, and it was used across the ancient Near East for the great goddess. Ishtar in Mesopotamia, Astarte in the Levant. Scholars debate which figure the Judeans in Jeremiah had in mind, and some think it's a blend that had taken on its own local life. What's not debatable is the shape of the practice. This is household religion. Multi-generational, organized, everybody with a role. Rainer Alberts, a German historian of Israelite religion, made an influential case that ancient Israel effectively ran two layers at once: the official religion of the state and the temple, and family religion practiced in homes and villages, with its own concerns. Fertility, childbirth, the harvest, protection from the ordinary catastrophes of ordinary life. The two layers overlapped and sometimes pulled against each other, and the people living in both would not have experienced that as a contradiction. You know this pattern. If you grew up Catholic, the official teaching and your grandmother's statue of St. Anthony turned around backwards until the car keys turned up are not the same religion, and she'd have been baffled by the suggestion that they conflicted. If you grew up evangelical, the systematic theology taught from the pulpit and the way your mother claimed a specific verse over a hospital room are not identical practices. Nobody in the house takes a survey. The kitchen has always had its own liturgy. That's not a scandal about anybody. It's what human religion actually looks like when you get close enough to see the dough. And then Jeremiah, chapter 44, which is one of the most remarkable scenes in the entire prophetic corpus. And I say that having spent real time with these books. The disaster has already happened. Jerusalem has fallen to Babylon in 586 BCE. The temple is destroyed. A group of Judean refugees has fled south into Egypt, and Jeremiah follows them and tells them the catastrophe came because they kept burning incense to the Queen of Heaven. And they answer him. The King James, and I'm going to give you enough of it that you get the full force. But we will certainly do whatsoever goeth forth out of our own mouth, to burn incense unto the Queen of Heaven, and to pour out drink offerings unto her, as we have done, we and our fathers, our kings, and our princes, in the cities of Judah, and in the streets of Jerusalem. For then had we plenty of victuals, and were well, and saw no evil. But since we left off to burn incense to the Queen of Heaven, and to pour out drink offerings unto her, we have wanted all things, and have been consumed by the sword and by the famine. That's not a confession. That's a rebuttal, and it's an evidence-based one. Their claim is that the years of the old practice were the good years, and the reform years were the years of collapse. You can disagree with their reasoning. Post-collapse arguments about cause are notoriously slippery in every century. But look at what's on the page. Ordinary people, most of them women, delivering a coherent counter-argument to a prophet in the middle of a prophetic book. And somebody kept it. That's the part I keep circling. Whoever compiled Jeremiah had every opportunity to summarize the exchange as stubbornness and move on. Instead, they wrote down the other side's best case, in the other side's own voice, and left it in the scroll that got copied and canonized and printed and put in the pew rack of a church in Tennessee 3,000 years later. Communities that are only interested in winning don't do that. Whatever else was going on, somebody in that chain thought the memory mattered more than the tidiness. Seventh name. And this one isn't a rival from a neighboring kingdom. This one is above. Elyon. In English Bibles, you meet him as the Most High, which reads like a title rather than a name, and for centuries, that's exactly how it was understood. One more way of saying Yahweh. But watch how the texts use it. Genesis chapter 14. Abram comes back from a battle and a figure appears out of nowhere. Melchizedek, king of Salem, described in the King James as priest of the Most High God. He blesses Abram. And a few verses later, Abram swears an oath and, in the King James, lifts up his hand unto the Lord, the Most High God. Yahweh and Elyon welded together in one phrase. That welding is the interesting part. The narrator doesn't explain who Elyon is. He assumes, and a lot of historians read that assumption as an older tradition showing through, a moment where the text is identifying Israel's God with a high God the audience already recognized. Psalm 82, the courtroom scene we looked at earlier, ends with the divine beings addressed this way in the King James. Ye are gods, and all of you are children of the Most High, children of Elyon, which gives you a family structure in the sky, with Elyon at the head. And now Deuteronomy, chapter 32, the Song of Moses, another poem whose Hebrew many linguists date very early. The standard Hebrew text behind your English Bible, the one preserved by the medieval scribes called the Masoretes, reads this way in the King James. When the Most High divided to the nations their inheritance, when he separated the sons of Adam, he set the bounds of the people according to the number of the children of Israel. For the Lord's portion is his people. Jacob is the lot of his inheritance. At a glance it passes. Elyon parcels out the nations, Yahweh gets Israel, keep reading. Except the last phrase is odd, and translators have known it was odd for a long time. Why would the borders of all the world's peoples be set according to the number of the children of Israel? The number doesn't correspond to anything. The Greek Septuagint, translated centuries before our oldest Hebrew copies, reads something different there, according to the number of the angels of God, which tells you the Hebrew those translators were working from said something other than children of Israel. Then 1947, and the caves near Qumran on the northwest shore of the Dead Sea, and the manuscripts that came out of them over the following decade. Among the Deuteronomy fragments is one cataloged as 4Q Deuteronomy J, generally dated to around the 1st or 2nd century BCE, roughly 1,000 years older than the medieval Hebrew manuscript scholars had before. And in that spot, it reads, Sons of God. Put it back in and read the 2 verses again. When the Most High divided the nations, their inheritance, he set the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. And Yahweh's portion is his people. Jacob is his allotted inheritance. In that reading, the nations are distributed among divine sons, and Israel is the portion that goes to Yahweh. Emmanuel Tov of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, who oversaw the publication of the Dead Sea Scrolls for years and wrote the standard textbook on Hebrew Bible textual criticism, the discipline of comparing ancient manuscripts to work out earlier forms of a text, discusses this as a likely case of a change made for theological reasons, part of a broader pattern where scribes softened phrasing that could suggest other divine beings. And I want to be careful about what that does and doesn't mean, because the popular version of this fact overshoots. It doesn't mean somebody snuck into a vault. Scribal adjustment in the direction of a community's settled beliefs is one of the most ordinary, well-documented phenomena in the history of manuscript copying, in every literature, in every language. It happens by degrees, over generations, in good faith, by people who believed they were clarifying rather than altering. Textual scholars find it in Homer. They find it in the New Testament. They find it in the Quran's transmission history. It's a feature of how hand-copied books survive. And it also isn't unanimous. Some scholars argue the reading history here is messier than the clean story suggests, and reconstructions of damaged fragments always carry uncertainty. What we can say with confidence is that an older Hebrew form of that verse, physically in our hands since the 1950s, has divine sons where the later form has Israel, and that the older form fits neatly with the world of Psalm 82, with the divine family known from Ugarit, and with the whole vocabulary we started this investigation in. Now step back, because 7 names is not the discovery. The shape they make is. Line them up in rough historical order rather than in the order the Bible prints them, and you get a trajectory. Earliest layer, a crowded sky, and Yahweh is magnificent within it. Who is like you among the gods? A great king above all gods. A divine assembly with an agenda and defendants. Each nation with its own divine patron, and border disputes argued in that shared language, which is exactly what Jephthah does with Chemosh, and exactly what Mesha does with Israel on a basalt slab now in Paris. Middle layer, exclusive loyalty. Not no gods exist, but no gods in my house. That's the commandment as it's actually worded. That's the reform impulse running through the books of Kings, aimed at what was happening on the ridge, in the temple-side rooms, at family hearths where the cakes were baked. Latest layer, the absolute claim. And it arrives, in its most uncompromising form, in the poetry of Isaiah chapter 40 through 55, which historians date to the exile in Babylon. Which brings up the question that makes this whole subject worth your time. Why then? Think about what exile does to a territorial God. The entire regional framework we've been tracing assumes that gods are tied to land and nation. Your people wins, your God is strong. Your temple falls, your God has lost. Judah's temple fell. By the logic of the whole ancient world, that was the end of the argument. And instead of accepting the verdict, someone in Babylon wrote poetry claiming that the God of a destroyed nation was the only God there is. The maker of light and darkness, the one who raises up the Persian king Cyrus as an instrument without Cyrus even knowing it, the God whose reach is not bounded by a border because there are no rival territories to be bounded from. That is an extraordinary intellectual move, made at the lowest possible moment, by people with nothing left to point to. Historians differ on the details of how and when, and there are serious scholars who argue the monotheistic idea was present much earlier and simply became dominant then. But the broad picture, that the exile is when the absolute claim becomes central and explicit, has wide support across the field. And here's the horizon, because this pattern isn't Jewish or Christian property. The declaration that God is one took shape in Arabia in a religious environment full of other deities, and Islamic tradition preserves that context in detail rather than erasing it. Hindu traditions have argued for millennia about the relationship between many devas and one underlying reality, and kept both languages alive in the same texts. Every tradition that thinks hard for a long time leaves the record of its thinking behind, and every tradition ends up teaching its conclusions to children faster than it can teach the reasoning. That last part is the real mechanism, and it's not sinister. It's a curriculum problem. A Sunday school hour is 40 minutes with construction paper. A confirmation class has a syllabus. A sermon has a congregation to serve on a Tuesday-shaped week. Conclusions travel. Arguments don't. So the 7th grader gets, "There is one God, and the other nations were confused," which is a fine summary and a poor history, and nobody involved intended a deception. The strange gift is that the tradition kept the raw material anyway. Solomon's hill with the dates attached. Jephthah's letter with Chemosh named respectfully. The Philistines calling Dagon their god in their own mouths. The women in Egypt getting the last word in the argument. It's all still printed, in every translation, unabridged, in the leather-bound one with somebody's name stamped in gold on the front cover. So what changes when you actually hold this? Something loosens, and it's worth naming precisely. If you were ever handed the job of defending the proposition that the Bible teaches strict monotheism from its first sentence, in a dorm hallway, across a Thanksgiving table, in a comment thread with somebody's skeptical cousin, you were handed an unwinnable assignment. Not because the Bible is weak, because that's not the claim the library makes about itself. It's the claim the last stage makes, and the library kept the earlier stages on purpose. You can put that assignment down. You were never obligated to carry it. What you get in exchange is more, not less. You get a text with depth of field, with a front and a back and 1,000 years between them. You get the ability to read a verse and ask which century is speaking, which is a skill that turns flat pages into a conversation between people who did not fully agree with each other. And you get one of the most impressive ideas in human history restored to its actual dramatic setting. One God is a much bigger thought when you know what it cost and when it was said. Announced from a throne, it's a slogan. Written by a refugee community whose temple was rubble and whose God was supposed to be dead. That's a different order of courage entirely, which loops back to the way of reading we've been using all along. Spinoza's position, worked out across the treatise of 1670 and the philosophy behind it, was that the deepest error is imagining God as one being among beings. A bigger king in a bigger palace, with rivals and moods and a jealous eye on the neighbors. In his framework, there is nothing outside of the whole for God to compete with, which means the entire question of divine rivalry dissolves rather than getting settled by somebody winning. And he draws a consequence from that, which is, honestly, the most useful thing in this whole investigation. In the last part of the ethics, he argues that the more we understand particular, individual things, the more we understand God. Particular things. Not abstractions. A basalt stone from Dagon with a king's boast on it. 2 storage jars in the Sinai with a blessing scratched on the side. A statue on a threshold in Ashdod. A family gathering firewood while the mother works the dough. a scrap of leather in a jar in a cave that sat there while empires came and went. In that way of seeing, the work you just did for the last half hour was not a detour away from the sacred. It was the direction of travel. Your questions were never the problem. Noticing that before me is a strange way to phrase a commandment about the only God there is. That's attention. Wondering how a shrine stays up for 3 centuries under kings the text calls faithful. That's a historian's instinct. Reading the women's speech in Jeremiah 44 and thinking, wait, they're making an argument. That's exactly what the compiler wanted you to see, or he'd have cut it. Down in the comments, I want 2 things, and be specific, because the specifics are what make these threads worth reading. First, which of the 7 had you genuinely never encountered before? Ashtoreth, Chemosh, Dagon, Milcom, Asherah, the Queen of Heaven, or Elyon? And second, the more interesting one. What did religion look like in your family's kitchen, as opposed to what got said from the front of the room? The candle, the saint statue, the specific verse taped to the fridge, the thing your grandmother did that nobody could explain. Jeremiah chapter 7 is a kitchen scene. I'd like to read yours. If this gave you something, subscribing and liking is what tells the system that slow, careful history has an audience. And there's a lot of trail left. The Kuntillet Ajrud drawings deserve their own hour. So does the Divine Council. So does the question of who Melchizedek was supposed to be. Send it to the person you thought about while watching. And if this raised the question of how a text like this got assembled, copied, corrected, and handed down in the first place, that's the exact ground the Bible wasn't written the way you were taught covers. It's the natural next stop from here, and worth an evening. The Hebrew Bible didn't start with one God. It arrived there, and it kept every step of the walk.